just wanted to contribute to the gathering with an aspect that I think is really important that starts getting attended to and developed by a group of people, which is the construction of social logic, cultural logic regarding these ideologies and philosophies of life and principles, political principles applied to civil discourses. The point being that human civilization, the society of nations, is an evolution of education. We entertain new concepts, principles, ideas, values, political ideologies, civil ideologies that get that become part of the social conversation, that become adopted by the political conversation. It creates, it generates laws, and it generates a continuance that later is applied to new ideas. It's sort of like building a tower. So it's important to understand how we got to this point, and it's a question I often see in a lot of these presentations. How did we get there? How did we go this far? How did we end up doing things like recruiting innocent kids from other countries to become our proof of social ideologies by having them get adopted by gay parents? It seems to go against their natural rights, which is to have a mom and a dad. And yet, so strong is these movements that are prevailing in the West that we order our rationale according to priorities which become, for example, the marriage rather than who's getting married, and that they are able to adopt, as individuals have a right to have children, more importantly than who are going to end up being the parents of these adopted children. Because all social thinking and the generalized ideological conversations of society are, like I'm saying, a tower that gets built and validates each step, each conclusionary step on things that were established, at one point popularized, and later established as rule or ideological principle. And so one leads to the other, and we're only able to affirm what comes later. And I'm talking about everything, not one side or political side in particular, or just how human civilization builds its cultural intellectuality, how we build our social conversations. They're based on principles that we established before. So, for example, we were really big on individualism in the 60s rather, the 70s. Individualism, human rights, self-determination. How these things that became sort of the vanguard of discourses, of conversations at the time, later get misapplied towards new conquering fields that maybe a group wants to make. Especially if we remove, for example, the subject of homosexuality from the natural, biological, chemical, medical, human sciences, and we bar it from getting developed or continuing to get developed where it was, and install it in the civil human rights principle of self-determination, freedom to choose the kind of life you want to live, and so forth. We take something that would have a different explanation as to how it occurs, what causes it to grow in society, and other sciences, human sciences that have to do with sociology and psychology, that would explain the truth of why homosexuality develops naturally in the human species. By killing that, and then we start building an artificial construct based on the conclusion that it simply happens by the will of God or nature, just designated to complement yourself with the same gender. And we establish that necessarily in order to make it a civil right, because you can't make it a civil right if it's something that may or may not happen according to how society treats us, how our parents nurture us growing up, what influences and effects social society and culture have upon us, and how we're treated as children, and what ideas are, roaming around the family as you're growing up, and so forth, which becomes a causation, something that happens to the individual growing up and developing their sense of self and sexuality. It no longer can be a civil right, because a civil right is something that we're all born with a right to. So by race, or by right to have food and water, shelter, respected, and so forth, and not treated violently, and all the things that can universally apply to, by virtue of being a human being, obligated the subject of homosexuality to become a fixed human issue. Like, basically, some people are born that way, right? Which is not true. So many people are not born that way, and the way they're treated, certain things that develop that happen to them, and the influences of society and culture started opening ways of, without getting into the science of homosexuality. The problem is that by having it forced as a category of human being, we start needing to constantly invent new rationale for example, for adopting, for why marriage. This is the funny part, is that the right to bond for life with another being is not really a transgression. You can have a best friend that you can be jealous of, even. It happens, especially in children, it happens a lot. So it wouldn't be really so unnatural and normal to have some kind of civil union. I mean, if two guys, are maturely consensual about sharing sexuality, and feel that they want to stay as a pair, as a couple together, there should be some form of, why not, legal union. But what seems strange is that we jumped over the fact that it is about two people of the same gender, as if that doesn't matter in terms of marriage. And when marriage is all about the building of society and the security and the structure around children and community, and how other couples also of sort of a natural or a majority type structure of family bond and creating community and so forth, it's all about the security, the inheritance, the natural inheritance of children learning from their ancestors, and maybe inheriting from families joining together, and everything that is about marriage has nothing to do with what could be a civil right, to create a bonding between two people of the same gender. Somehow that discernment was completely ignored and passed right over, which is amazing to me. And it led to us enforcing our need to validate this artificial construction by recruiting innocent children to have a lesbian couple for parents. Nobody seems to see the egregiousness and just how much it veers off what I see as the Tower of Pizza. They keep, instead of just making it straight, they kept trying to make it without bringing it down and building it up again. They kept trying to, and they wanted to get to the final height it was meant to have. The builders kept moving stories further off towards the other side so that it wouldn't fall over. And so now, if you try to make the Tower of Pizza straight at the base, it would look like a banana, because they try to compensate as they were building up. Anyways. Um, so yeah, this part of how did we get to this point, I think is really important. And people, obviously, with a lot of knowledge, and I see documentaries all the time in this capacity where they explain, for example, how they made the consumer stupid, and they narrow it, they zoom in on the people that were influential, that invented, the fathers of marketing, the father of individualism, and Ayn Rand and all these people who were promoting ideas. We need to sort of understand what led some people to misadopt a principle so that we can deconstruct the whole path that led to where we are. That in itself needs to be an area of work, an area where we can go back step by step and see, okay, this principle was actually more intended to be applied and to have a conversation about contextually that time and what was happening then. And so at one point, for the majority of its use was appropriate, until this group used it to build something else they wanted to affirm. And that's where it took a fork in the road in the wrong direction. And, all of human civilization actually could be mapped out that way. All of it. For example, the emergence of Marxism actually came from a moment in which we were taking a leap in human sciences, and we were starting to understand psychology and the development of the human being, and as a child in a family, and what leads to complexes and traumas. And so this whole area of human sciences had come to the intellectual scene, and things were brought into question, like the disparity of why do some people have all the power, keep all the benefits, and masses are lagging behind in poverty and never getting to reap the benefits of the advancement of civilization. And so these conversations started appearing it started growing. There were obviously happening before, otherwise we wouldn't have had revolutions in the past. But now we were starting to say we are capable of becoming better in the mind. This happens to us. We're taught, we're influenced, and so we started dabbling with our mental development and the capacity of psychology and such. And this enriched the area of, well, politicians are being greedy. You don't need to have all the power. A government is nothing but an instrument that administrates and runs a country, and so could we not develop instruments of government that are more equitable, that don't result in people becoming, greedy or abusive, overwhelmed with power to where they become monsters, and God knows what kinds of conversations they were having. And so new ideas, new concepts for different types of governance started getting talked about. Obviously, they didn't. When a proposal is much more difficult and intricate and profound in the points it wants to address and resolve, it becomes that much more difficult to succeed in doing the right way that conforms best to ultimately what would be always the response of our human nature. And so the proposals and the solutions that were first created were eventually demanded power and injustice and suppression and obligation, which kind of went against the original concept of governments that would be fairer and would no longer be abusive against the people, and would no longer hoard power in a pyramidical sense, but would distribute power and benefit. And when they tried implementing a design, a governmental design, they realized that it was they didn't see it was so bad, but they were so bad that they ended up becoming oppressive and forcing people to conform. And that's why these ideas never led to better governments than what we've always known. But we don't get to revisit and revise our errors and how we got to our worst results or predicaments if we don't have we don't give more importance to the revisionist revisiting or, I mean, reversal path analysis of how things developed, and we're not able to draw a map because that's kind of like that would be sort of a way of liberating ourselves from immovable decisions that we made in the past. We can see that wasn't a bad idea. That was meant in this way. It was never meant to be something bad or oppressive. And look at where it went wrong. We can understand why these people took it away from where it was meant to go, or others, where the few people who created it were meaning for it to go. It empowers us to be able to see that map, that developmental map in hindsight. And I think it's very important for the conversation of gender ideology and how we have resolved human homosexuality in a sort of social, intellectual way, to be able to see why we made a mistake and stopping to think of it as something natural that is actually kind of lifting a red flag. It's an alarm bell. Is saying, you know what, we're not raising our kids and so the right way, in a way that really develops their sense of self, and so nature resorts to them continuing to seek love through the same gender. It's a phenomenon that nature does for reasons that we are far from understanding. We simply found it too difficult, too intimately toiling, too challenging, and also being drawn away from it by other things that preoccupied us more. And so we answered the question in a haphazard way, half-assed way. We just decided to make it into a category. It's always been the tendency. We've always kind of said, those are people who are gay. And it's always been the generalized assumption of humanity in the past that those are just people that are that way. And it wasn't until we start developing human sciences after the era of when Marxism arose and such, especially when it became more sophisticated in the 50s, I believe, maybe 40s, 50s, when we started really talking about, hey, no, look, we have examples. We see clearly how this person, look at the parents they had and look at the parents these guys had, and how none of them came out looking for sex in the same gender and needing sex and love from the same gender. And here we have typically a lot of guys that start looking for love from the same gender, and wouldn't you know, their parents, their social environment, the way they were treated by their siblings and peers, all have common denominators. And so we really saw it, but unfortunately we didn't know what to do with it. We started thinking, perhaps mistakenly thinking it was an illness. We never really hammered the concept that nature does it because it's trying to fulfill something that wasn't developed properly. It's trying to compensate. And so because we never saw it that way, and we never were able to assume social responsibility and see the individuals as the victims, not the culprits, or not something that came because of them or from them, or because the devil used them, or something. We've never been able to turn that around and fully embrace the fact that we caused this to the individuals in our society. So if those two things were put back where they should be, because we still don't assume social responsibility for it, we've concluded, in order to shut up the human sciences, nature sciences understanding of human sexuality as to why homosexuality, we decided to quash that, put a lid on it, ban it in the law, so it doesn't trouble us anymore, and just turn it into a classification of human being which prescribes you needing to be born that way in order to be a civil right. It's amazing what we've done, and all that needs to be undone. And then once we realize we take homosexuality for a natural aspect of human sexuality with a biological, chemical, human, medical understanding of it, like all parts of the human body are medical, respiratory, digestive. It's all concerning medicine when we want to understand it. So should homosexuality. Even if we realize, no, this is actually, we should be grateful that somehow nature says, in order for this person to not sink into nothingness, they continue wanting to live thanks to a compensation that nature creates by having them naturally be drift towards wanting to continue nurture that sense of self, except that after puberty it becomes sort of fixed in a way that has to do with nurturing through the same gender. Self-satisfaction that would address a continued development that no longer is possible can occur. But that doesn't mean that there may not be social ways. If social influences before adolescence, and of course there's also some things that have to do with a chemical, a setup that was more conducive to be affected a certain way by certain things than other initial chemical biological setups in that person. So there are some pre-birth things that may make a person more vulnerable to being affected in things that will be conducive towards homosexuality than other people. So the whole shebang can be understood as a single topic. In any case, it still doesn't make the individual the source of it occurring. It still has to do with us not caring about how a person develops sexually, basically. That's what it comes to. We don't, as a human science, as a human civilization, we don't seem to, we care about a person being athletic, not being fat, not, being healthy. We care about them developing a whole bunch of stuff that has to do with their body, eating well, what have you. But for some reason, or, having good eyesight, or not having, but for some reason we don't seem to care, that their legs develop strong, things that happen naturally. Sexuality seems to be more vulnerable to social afflictions and its own development and maturation. So I see all sexual subjects as having to do with maturation. And until we're able to say the civilization, the social civilization of people have everything to do with how each individual develops in their sexuality, much, much more than we ever realized before, we won't be able to start treating it like something that we have some ownership, some control over, some desire for it to mature and be a certain way, complete its development in all the aspects that it needs, it requires for it to develop fully. And it is directly tied to sense of self-confidence, self-confidence in your sexuality, in your interaction, in your belief in self before the rest of the collective, of the community of people. There is no separation between sexual development and then how we perceive ourselves or how we perceive the world sees us. It's all, we were there already. We were already dabbling in all this, in this science, but we made a grave error around the time of Christopher Street and Stonewall and so forth it was too much. We got overwhelmed, and some idiots, as always, there are idiots that have too much power for their capacity, for their intelligence, and decided to take it a certain way, that these were the things that we could not allow, and therefore, in order for those things to not be allowed, we had to cement certain ideas, and they gave it a form that started on regarding it as a civil right, which automatically killed the biological understanding of homosexuality and made it into a civil ideology. It's like that's where the tragic fork in the road in American sciences went, and then we went on to try to obligate the rest of the world to follow that for political reasons, because we were convinced that it was a higher way of understanding the human rights. Ideologies are terrible. They are instructions on how you should think, instead of just knowing ourselves, instead of just understanding the human brain, how the collective functions and all the dynamics that interact between us and how we're wired to be for us to simply function as societies in the most natural way possible. Ideologies come saying, this is my idea of how we should work, and they start imposing it's terrible. Ideologies should just be perceptive concepts that try to describe what is already there, not something that would enforce the behavior of societies. So that's where we are. But anyways, I just wanted to add this. Thanks a lot.